Good afternoon. My name is Amyas Phillips. I'm the chair of the IoTSF Supply Chain Integrity Project. I'm going to tell you a bit about supply chain integrity and the work we're doing and give you a preview of some early results. I'd like to start by asking you to imagine that a new equipment's turned up in your facility, right? You've selected it very carefully with a rigorous procurement process, and you've taken into account its excellent security certifications. You're happy to have it, and you're looking forward to putting it to work. Right? In that situation, it's natural to accept what you've got at face value, but you're making an assumption if you do that, and not just a small one, quite a big one. You're assuming that what's being delivered to you is what you were promised, but actually, what guarantee do you have? You think you have the latest widget, but what you actually have is a black box. The assets sitting in front of you now have traveled a long supply chain to reach you. So when you decide to let this device into your system, you're deciding to trust a large part of that supply chain as well. The reality is that it could potentially have been compromised at any point. We know from numerous well-documented examples that cyber attacks are frequently launched via supply chains. There's some very well-known attacks, both in hardware and increasingly in software supply chains, including reportedly Stuxnet in 2008, and in 2017, NotPetya, which is still the most damaging single cyber attack in history. These attacks have frequently been able to achieve arbitrary code execution on the entire user base of a product for relatively little investment of effort on the part of the attackers. Cyber criminals use them to extort or steal from consumers and businesses, and advanced persistent threat groups use them to survey or sabotage specific targets. There are indications that supply chain attacks are growing in popularity as well. Last year, Symantec reported a 78% increase over 2018. And in May this year, Sonatype reported a 430% increase in open source malware attacks in the preceding 10 months over the period before that. You could be caught up in one of these attacks, possibly as a target, or more likely as collateral damage. Now, other organizations have given serious consideration to the problems of securing trusted assets in the supply chain. In the general ICT supply chain, much of the concern was and still is driven by defense departments who around in the 2000s realized that their supply chains increasingly extended into the jurisdictions of geopolitical competitors. And around the same time, grey market parts became an increasing concern in highly regulated sectors like aerospace and medical. The massive growth in open source ecosystems and software as a service since then has lengthened software supply chains too, which has kept it very topical. And there are a number of quite mature sets of recommendations available. Nowadays, even the biggest cybersecurity frameworks, including operational ones, they recognize the fact that they can't be met without the involvement of suppliers, and that includes the NIST cybersecurity framework and the ISO 27000 family. Amongst the IoT security frameworks, that's true to a lesser extent. Most of their focus has been given to defending devices against remote and hands-on attacks in their deployed state. But the supply chain still gets a nod in some cases. Very few people I've found have given thought to creating highly trustworthy devices, and in particular, that's been those manufacturing secure elements, especially those in the SIM card field where there are multiple vendors and therefore a necessity for common standards to be upheld. Going further afield in the software industry, fairly recently, the industry realized that open source supply chains have grown so deep that end users often have no idea what code they're running. They need to know so they can patch vulnerabilities, and several efforts are now underway to define software bills of materials, quite strongly pushed again by US federal agencies. Another group of documents it was led by Microsoft, I think, who developed the first secure development practices guide in response to Windows's tortuous transition to the online era. But nowadays, there's a quite good selection of well-tried secure software development frameworks to follow. All this work has ideas we can use to help secure IoT supply chains. And if you ask me to boil down what they all said, then there is just one idea at the topmost level, and that is you need to assure the integrity of parts through the supply chain. If you break that down a little bit further, you get three principles. That is, first of all, you need to know what you've got. Second, you need to know where it came from, otherwise you can't make any kind of judgment about it. And thirdly, you need to push security controls upstream to protect it. These are sound principles, but obviously they're very high level, and applying them to our own supply chains as operators of IoT or suppliers of operators of IoT is quite difficult. We still have a lot of chin pulling to do to work out how to put those high level principles into practice, or indeed where more detailed principles are available, how to apply those specifically to IoT supply chains, which aren't necessarily the same as the general ICT ones. You find ourselves asking questions like, what assets do I have? Where did they come from? Who handled them? What has been done to them, and how should those operations have been secured? That was the background to, in April this year, the IoTSF's initiation of the Supply Chain Integrity Project, which aims to help actors throughout the IoT supply chain take practical steps to protect themselves and their customers from cyber attacks on IoT deployments launched via design, production, and distribution processes. Thanks to the IoTSF's broad membership, we've had contributions from experts representing pretty much all the stakeholders in the supply chain. I'll give you a preview now of two pieces of work which are currently in progress. The first piece of work is a general description of the IoT supply chain. There are, of course, as many different IoT supply chains as there are models of IoT device. So we started by looking at a selection, and we saw that the same things always happen, but they can happen in very different places in different ways, depending on the particular supply chain. So instead of building a supply chain around actors, we built this generalization around operations, which we see that are common to IoT supply chains. So in this document, we unpack the IoT supply chain and identify the key security critical operations. And the aim is that it should help you apply supply chain security recommendations from whatever security framework you're using to your IoT supply chain. It might be especially useful for IT departments trying to extend their cyber supply chain risk management practices to new operational technology deployments. So this should be available at the beginning of next year, but I'll give you a preview of a couple of results now. Right, one of the main things the document points out is that the IoT supply chain delivers many things, not just what eventually arrives on your site, or at least you have to consider all the different parts that make that up. In that equipment that arrives on your site, you have a variety of different pieces of hardware, in particular the microprocessor. You've probably got sensors, actuators, casework. I say casework, I mean, it could very well be an entire locomotive or a light aircraft. There's a number of logical components, and most devices these days have some kind of roots of trusts installed. There'll be some application software, there'll be trust anchors installed, and other kinds of configuration data. And in some supply chains, then identity secrets would have been installed by the supply chain as well. Thirdly, and often rather underappreciated, is that supply chains have to supply trust downstream. They need to provide assurances. As the operator of the device, you need to trust it to behave as you expect, even under attack. And to do that, you can either screw up your eyes and hope for the best, or you need some kind of assurances, probably a collection of them, that this device and all these components and their precursors have been correctly designed and implemented, and that their confidentiality and integrity have been protected. Second, and this is unique to IoT, IoT devices are useless until they're connected into larger applications. Uh, so we consider that that connection is one of the functions of the IoT supply chain. Those applications need to be told which devices to trust and how to authenticate them, and that can be accomplished in a variety of ways, all involving telling the application to trust devices which can prove possession of specified secret keys. So, takeaway from this is that it's actually quite misleading to talk about securing the IoT supply chain as if it's some kind of linear thing. It's actually many chains, one for each of these components, or a better analogy is probably a tree. So let's take a look at the tree. System design, one of the subtrees, partitions the functions into hardware and software and selects key components and outputs hardware design files and the production process instructions. One of those components is going to be the microprocessor. That, of course, has its own highly complex and deep supply chain. One we probably have rather little influence over. It delivers ICs to us literally as little black boxes. Many of those microcontrollers now ship with various roots of trust, small and immutable sets of functions and data which can validate the rest of the system and perform other services. Those ROTs have a significant software component which has to be handled in the clear. So ROT establishment has to be done in a highly trusted environment. That environment must be as trusted as the root of trust itself, and in fact can limit how trustworthy that root of trust can be considered. A common root of trust is the initial bootloader, as already mentioned, in a secure boot chain, which is capable of validating the next piece of software before running it. What does it validate against? Some kind of trust anchor. And installation of that trust anchor is a key moment in the life of an IoT device because the holder of the corresponding code signing key determines what software runs and therefore how the device behaves. They have pretty much full control of the behavior of the device. We call this claiming. Right, at this point, we've now embarked on the process of getting the device into a known, trusted, logical state, which we call provisioning. There's a variety of tasks involved in that and considerable automation. And we often see purpose-built provisioning tools being used. Other provisioning steps include the application load, preceded by application development, and often a separate configuration data load. Once the device is in a known trusted state, it can be onboarded to the central application. Onboarding the device is in fact an assertion that it is an authentic device in a known trusted state. A device can be onboarded multiple times at different points. For example, onboarding to a central application has to happen after application provisioning, but an attestation root of trust can be onboarded to an attestation server directly after the root of trust establishment. Finally, the device enters operation, where it may change hands, undergo various forms of reset, or receive software updates. Every node in this tree is an integration operation, and every edge is an asset moving between operations. And there's potential for compromise of those assets at any node or any edge. The operations I put in yellow can be multiple and can occur in different orders and really at any time up to the point of installation, depending on your particular supply chain's provisioning sequence. In the white paper, we outline each of these contributory supply chains and how they're secured, identifying relevant existing works. And we also unpack the IoT device supply chain. You can think of it as the trunk of the tree with the key security critical activities in it and the variety of ways they're accomplished. And again, our aim is that anyone should be able to describe their own supply chain in these terms and identify the key security critical operations in it. The second piece of work we're doing is a set of supply chain recommendations, updating and expanding on the compliance framework's existing supply chain recommendations. There's 29 recommendations at the moment in 4 groups, those groups being how you can align security goals and measures up and down the supply chain, how you can assure the quality, authenticity, and integrity of parts moving through the supply chain, how you conduct those security critical operations in the IoT supply chain, and finally, how you set about doing security maintenance, which is something the IoT supply chain, especially the software part, is responsible for throughout the life of the device. The recommendations are um, graduated into 5 compliance classes from less to more rigorous. They're written for all actors in the IoT supply chain, uh, from end users to IP vendors. They're intended to be implementable and qualitatively certifiable, and they're currently about to move into review by the Compliance Framework Work Group. To conclude, then, if you're at the point where you or your customers can't take the trustworthiness of IoT devices for granted, then basically watch this space. The IoTSF will be publishing these tools very soon. If you're active in the IoT supply chain as a supplier, a customer, a certifier, a security expert, a regulator, or in any other capacity, and you want to see IoT grow and deliver more benefits to your business and society, then please consider getting involved. Security, after all, is a team sport, especially in the supply chain. If you want to do that, then please contact me. These are my details. You can reach me by email, on LinkedIn, or by Twitter, or join the IoTSF and the Supply Chain Integrity Project, where I look forward very much to working with you. Thank you very much.